We just heard the single most popular song the Beatles ever recorded, at least according to the youth of America. We'll get into that and so much more with today's returning guest, Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez. That was, of course, Here Comes the Sun, for the 6 or 7 people on planet Earth who wouldn't know that. Track 1 on side 2 of the Beatles' classic album, Abbey Road, an album marking its 50th anniversary this year, with a new single-disc stereo remix, a 2-disc deluxe edition, and a 3-disc Super Deluxe edition filled with all sorts of unreleased goodies. Well, we have a lot to unpack here. And Robert, welcome back to the show. And it seems that we're always celebrating 50th anniversaries on this program.
I suspect we're going to run out next year.
Yeah, that is true. But next year's going to be a big year, that's for sure.
Huge. You get the overlap between Beatles and solo.
It's going to be enormous. I'll be calling you every few weeks, probably.
Yeah.
But what I'd like to do is start out by discussing the Abbey Road album in the context of its times. Although Let It Be was released the year after and appeared to most people as the group's swan song, this is actually the last album the Beatles recorded. And I recall in the anthology documentary that the 3 surviving Beatles claimed that they went into it knowing that this was going to be the last album. So let's make it the big final statement. Mm-hmm. But Beatles biographer Mark Lewison has been touting his rediscovery, I guess is the best way to put it, of a recording of a 1969 business meeting where John, Paul, and George, Ringo wasn't there, were discussing the possibility of a next album, a follow-up to Abbey Road. So on the surface, it would appear like there are conflicting stories regarding this album. What do you make of all of this?
Well, it's funny because things go in and out of fashion as far as prevailing theories of Beatle history. And then come 9/11, 6 weeks ago, when Mark Lewison is discussing in The Guardian this tape of an Apple meeting held just before Abbey Road was released. And this was being exploited like bombshell. It's going to rewrite everything you know about Beatle history. They're talking about their next album. Well, things had always been open-ended with the Beatles. And this is not anything we didn't know about anyway, going back to the 70s, when it was quoted extensively in a couple of books that were published in John Lennon's lifetime. And I say, just based on my own discussions with people who were there, such as journalist Ray Connolly, who's a good friend of them, is that don't give it too much weight. It's not anything that we didn't really already know about. And, of course, the date of this meeting, like 10 days later, is when John decides he's had enough and turns in his resignation asking for a divorce. Even that wasn't unequivocal. It was something that he mostly meant until he didn't, and then come 6 months later, Paul puts out the McCartney album and gets headlines as, I'm quitting the Beatles, which is not what he said at all. That's when John expressed a resentment. I turned in my notice back when, and that I broke the Beatles up. I formed a band, and I broke them up. So it was very important to him to have that title for some reason. But as far as what they were doing in 69 and Abbey Road being the last, I think they were headed towards something, whether it was not permanent, maybe it was an open-ended relationship. I think they were headed towards something, and they were sort of clearing the decks. They were using all these songs, all this material going back, some of it to Rishikesh, some of it to the January 69 sessions at Twickenham, and they were sort of clearing the decks. It's hard to argue that they didn't have a sense that the status quo is going to change for us, where we roll from one project into another. It's hard to see where they weren't at least having that kind of feeling when, even if you look at the footage that was taken at Tittenhurst on the day of their last photo shoot, how exhausted, how tired, how they just look like, can we be done with this now? They might not have the conscious thought that we're going to split and this is going to be our last album. But I think they all were sick of the business fighting that was going on all year with Alan Klein and the bad feelings it was making. So I think at the very least they were going to take some time off there.
It's worth noting that what's discussed on the tape, for the benefit of anyone listening who doesn't know what we're talking about, it's the Beatles, primarily John, dividing up future Beatle albums between he, Paul, and George, with 4 songs each, and then letting Ringo do 1 or 2 if he wanted to. It's an idea that John floated a few years later in a 1971 interview with journalist David Wigg, where he suggests bereaved Beatles fans make their own fantasy Beatle albums out of their solo material.
If people need the Beatles so much, all they have to do is to buy each album, put it on tape, track by track, one of me, one of Paul, one of George, one of Ringo, if they really need it that much, because otherwise the music is just the same, only on separate albums.
I think a lot of the hoopla over the tape was to really just promote Mark Lewison's one-man lecture tour that he's been on.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
You know, make it seem like there's this big revelatory thing happening. It wasn't really. But, yeah, I get the point. And it just seems like with the Beatles that there was some kind of fatigue they'd reached, but they were very open-ended. I mean, John Lennon himself is talking about, you know, it could be an end, but it could be a rebirth, just
right.
even before the Paul McCartney thing came out. So I think, you know, being Mr. Out-In, he was of two minds about everything. But by the time that he'd, you know, made that announcement to them, Paul had it. Right. And that's where he goes to Scotland to regroup. And he says explicitly in that Life magazine article that comes out when they're investigating the Paul is dead thing, that Beatles thing is over. You know, partly because of us and partly because of outside forces. And John married Yoko and I married Linda. And so you recognize that things are coming to a halt. But I think that they never really thought we're never going to work together again until that's how it played out. Because even George Harrison, who of all people had reason to not want to be in the Beatles anymore, he's talking in spring of '70 about it would be very selfish if the Beatles didn't work together anymore. You know, talking about how they have so much power as a collective, what good they can do. You know, they can do their solo excursions, but by that time you had Crosby, Stills, and Nash setting the precedent for having this group of this collective that operates together and separately.
That was take 5 of Come Together from the new Beatles Super Deluxe edition of Abbey Road. Our guest today is Beatles author and expert and host of the Something About the Beatles podcast, Robert Rodriguez. Robert, I remember where I was the first time I heard this album. It was maybe the third or fourth Beatle album I ever owned. What about you, your first experience listening to Abbey Road?
I remember that I think I, even back then, as a, I don't know, maybe 12-ish, when I heard it all the way through, and right on the heels of Pepper, because I heard that. That was, I think, the first album I heard all the way through by the Beatles after the Red and the Blue album.
Right.
And I remember thinking, God, this is just amazing. So many good songs, but I felt warmer toward Abbey Road than I did to Pepper, just because Pepper was just sort of, it wasn't exactly rock band stuff.
Right.
It was sort of theatrical to me, and my own taste, you know, then as now, were more toward, you know, pure rock and roll. So I do remember thinking that Abbey Road was an amazing thing. And the funny thing is that it's probably in my top 3 or 4 of Beatle albums, maybe 5, depending on the mood. But when you come back to it after spending time away with fresh ears, you just are stunned by how good these guys were and how great they sounded together. I mean, it's just amazing that there's not a note out of place or a harmony that shouldn't be there or anything. The quality control and the craftsmanship, it just is stunning, even by today's standards, what they pulled together when you know the circumstances of these sessions spread out over 1969.
And it's so well recorded. I mean, this album might actually be the best sounding Beatles album, but it never sounds not contemporary, whereas something like Sgt. Pepper, you know, a lot of that does sound of its time.
It's like the Yellow Submarine film. It
right.
Definitely is. It screams Summer of Love. Yeah, you don't hear that so much of like, oh, yeah, it's 1969. No, you don't. It does sound like very contemporary pop. That there was certainly, you don't talk much about the influence of Abbey Road, but certainly in terms of production and songcraft, that lived on, and you can see its fingerprints and other things that followed.
Oh, absolutely, and all through the 70s. So I thought we could quickly run through the track list and talk about the original running order. Mm-hmm. And we heard an early take of it just a moment ago. Side 1, Cut 1, Come Together.
It's funky. That's the thing about it, you know, as John described it. And, you know, that's kind of atypical of the Beatles, but with that bass and that unbelievable drum pattern Ringo does, and just John's vocal and the cool harmony lead guitar on it, it's really grandiose, bigger than the sum of its parts production, for sure. And it doesn't sound like anything else they did. And, yeah, you could say its roots were in Chuck Berry, but, you know, Chuck never sounded like that.
That's true. And Cut 2 on side 1, we have to talk about this song because it's such an iconic song in the Beatles catalog. George Harrison's Something. Frank Sinatra called it one of the greatest love songs ever written, and he's a guy who would know a thing or two about love songs. And here we see George Harrison very clearly and definitively besting Lennon and McCartney in terms of any other song on this album. And Here Comes the Sun would be right there with it, actually. That would live on and become pretty much a standard.
Yeah, they thought so for sure. And the thing is, it's got that instant appeal to it in a way that was not really his strong suit. Even in his solo career, he seemed to be producing the kind of material that tended to grow on you after repeated listenings because there's so many layers and depth to it. But that is like maybe the high water mark of his crafting something that is both meaningful to him and effortlessly commercial at the same time. You know, and the song itself is so sort of ambivalent in the lyrics, you know. It's not a straight-up love song in the usual sense at all. And maybe that's just another Harrisonian touch that gives it a little extra depth to it that, you know, what is he saying? I mean, I guess he likes the girl, but, you know, I don't want to leave her now. You know, I believe in how. You know, what does he mean? You know, it's just a very intriguing lyric.
From side 2 of Abbey Road, as heard on this new Super Deluxe edition, remixed by Giles Martin, son of George Martin, You Never Give Me Your Money. We're talking with Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez as we very quickly go through the track listing on the original album. That brings us to a song on side 1, also written by Paul McCartney, like the one we just heard, but not held in quite the same high esteem, especially by the other 3 Beatles. It's Maxwell's Silver Hammer, a kind of twisted nursery rhyme.
Yeah, it's funny about that one, that a song that's so innocuous in terms of it shouldn't be so polarizing, but it really is a lightning rod, and certainly amongst the other Beatles who, you know, just lavished great disdain upon it, even this hyperbole. You know, John saying we spent more hours on that song, and Paul wanted to be a single, and it never could be a single, and Ringo talking about spending weeks on it. Like, no, they didn't. They spent 3 days on it. You know, and George says, Paul's songs were still fruity. You know, it's like, it doesn't merit that kind of disdain. I'm not really sure why it drew all that. I mean, it's certainly, you know, did you have a similar problem with Your Mother Should Know or When I'm 64? I'm not sure. Or Honey Pie. But to me, what makes it all the more intriguing is that it is a dark comedy piece from Paul McCartney. And the only other person I could think of as writing stuff like that at the same time is Ray Davies. And that's kind of an exceptional thing.
Then it's back to the 50s for an early rock and roll pastiche from Paul, featuring maybe the most screaming vocals he'd laid down since Long Tall Sally, Oh Darling. Yeah,
you know, that's one that as much as I love the recording of that and the performance, which is amazing, especially in the rock band era where you get to hear the nice isolations, what's going on there, particularly the vocal. When Anthology came out, we had that run-through from Apple Studio where John and Paul harmonize on it.
Right.
Like, it makes you wonder the what-ifs, because that was a song that, you know, while John is being very critical of any number of Paul McCartney songs between the Rolling Stone interview and the Playboy interview, that was one that I think he was particularly enamored of because he never stopped talking about how he should have sung it, but it was Paul's song, so what the hell. You know, if they had done something more group-sounding, I think that probably would elevate its status in Beatledom as a real nice Beatle full band performance.
And next up, another kind of children's song, Ringo's Octopus's Garden.
Ringo writes his cosmic songs without even knowing it, according to George.
That's true, right.
I love that.
It's sort of a son of Yellow Submarine, but it's a little more sophisticated.
Sure, and it has multiple levels to it, as George pointed out. You know, there's definitely a level of spirituality to it. Plus, the fact is it's rooted in a real-life incident. You know, when he'd walked out in the summer of '68 of the White Album sessions, and he's on Peter Sellers' yacht talking to the captain who's describing what an octopus's garden is to him. So he had that real-life incident that he built a song around. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
We're going to skip the next cut, which would end side 1, I Want You, She's So Heavy, for reasons we'll get into later, but it's a very sparse lyric. It's just one man's aching longing for Yoko Ono. In this case, that man is John Lennon, obviously. We flip the record over, and we begin with a song, and I alluded to this at the very beginning of this interview, a song that has become the most popular Beatles track with people who stream music and listen to Beatles music on the internet.
Yes. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
For a song that was never a single, but it's still lodged in popular consciousness.
And that brings us to track 2 on side 2 of the album, Because, which was inspired by John hearing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata played backwards, featuring some beautiful 3-part harmony work from John, Paul, and George, echoes of This Boy and Yes It Is. I mean, they were never going to give the Hi-Los a run for their money, but it's still a beautiful piece and rather cosmic, as George would say.
Stunningly beautiful. And just when you think about how late in the day this was for them to get together and work out the harmony parts, of course, under George Martin's direction. But it was very painstaking, the recording of that, so much so because they're trying to match each other's phrasing, and the melody line or the harmony lines change throughout. They don't stay constant in fifths or thirds. But at one point, John was so exasperated, he said, "I wish I hadn't written the bloody thing."
Then we get to the medley, or at least the first part of it, and we heard that earlier. You Never Give Me Your Money, which goes into Sun King, then Me, Mr. Mustard, Polythene Pam, She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, there's a pause there, we get into Golden Slumbers, Carry That Weight, The End, and then, of course, the hidden track, Her Majesty, which was originally part of that medley. And as you mentioned earlier, a lot of these were songs and bits and bobs that had been hanging around ever since the previous year, and they're just kind of exquisitely woven together to sound as if that was the intention all along, but it really wasn't.
Yeah, certain songs like Mean Mr. Mustard, if they'd been left to be fleshed out as compositions, might have worn out their welcome sooner had it been 2.5, 3 minutes instead of the minute 10 or whatever it is. So I think, it shows the exquisite judgment these guys had of their strengths. And it's like, no, this works as, a lick or fragment, but just when it starts to, reach the point of no return, we'll pivot and switch to this, and then it'll keep the interest going, sustain the energy. And that's what they did, just as they wisely pulled Her Majesty out of it once they had gotten past the point of we're going to alternate John and Paul songs, and it just didn't work. It just stopped it dead.
So we've done the easy part, Robert.
Okay.
We've gone through the original album. Now let's talk about 2019.
Mm-hmm.
Your thoughts on this Giles Martin remix?
Well, I was a little skeptical in advance, knowing that his hands were going to be on it, just because, as you'd mentioned earlier, it is so well engineered and sonically sophisticated compared to all their other output. With the change in the technology for that album, the 8 tracks and the solid state board with a nod to Ken Womack. So they definitely had advanced their technology when it came to recording. But he found ways, definitely, to upgrade the sound, and that's to his credit. As far as the remixes go, as a general principle, I would say this to fans, I suspect that his reasoning with the decisions he made was that he didn't want to or set out to replace the mixes that we've known and loved for 50 years or so.
Right.
Rather, he wanted to offer alternatives that highlighted elements that we might not have, that nobody knew about or hadn't heard before, that might give you another way of looking at the songs. So they're nice sort of, different versions or alternatives that you can have to maybe give you some fresh insights, but I don't think they're meant to stand on their own as like, yes, this is the new definitive version of the Beatles. And I don't think that was his intent.
So let's get to the part that everybody's waiting for, and that's the unreleased material in this Super Deluxe Box Set. And some of it I had heard before on bootleg, never in this fidelity. But were there any surprises for you?
I was a little surprised because not many people know about it, except the people that have been collecting bootlegs forever, that Something, as performed, and it was this rare occasion where John Lennon sat in on the recording of a George Harrison song. He's playing piano on it, and that when the song ends, the point we're familiar with, that he then launched into this dirge-like, slow piano-based jam that they all fell in on. And it was, you can sort of look at it as like a primitive version of Layla. You got this piano coda that has nothing to do with the whole rest of the song, but it's interesting nonetheless. And I don't know if that was ever a serious consideration or if it was just something that happened spontaneously in the moment. And so I thought they might present that as one of the outtakes, but they didn't. And the thing I was thinking was, well, since he basically took that chord sequence and for his first solo album did the song Remember based on it, maybe it would have been a Lennon-Ono copyright or something. They just didn't want to go there.
Well, what I thought we'd do is each pick a favorite from these outtakes, and the one I've chosen as my favorite is I Want You, She's So Heavy, the Trident recording session and reduction mix. And the reason I chose this is because there's some studio chatter in the very beginning of this take that illustrates exactly who John Lennon was, because someone in an adjoining studio at Abbey Road has complained that the band is playing too loud. And John hears this over the talkback just as they're about to go into another version of the song. And John says, well, we're going to continue playing it loud. And then he says, but, you know, if they want it quiet, we'll try it quiet too. So it's interesting that he immediately capitulates after.
He was still Mimi's boy.
My boys are ready to go.
Well, that was my choice for favorite outtake from the 50th anniversary of Abbey Road box set. Robert, you're up next. Which one will you pick?
Yeah, I think what was very insightful to me, it was a bit of a holy grail. It's not, you know, there's obviously in existence more than we're getting in this set. But I was thinking about the Ballad of John and Yoko session tape, because that was something that was written about in books years ago about, you know, the person who wrote the book was describing what was on the session tape and just John and Paul's interactions. And it hadn't been bootlegged to this point, which was amazing to me. But I was very happy to get that take where you really get a sense of the camaraderie and the energy and just the real high level of working together that John and Paul had on this session.
Yeah, and this is right in the heat of the battles over Klein.
Yes, and it was about to get even more heated. This was April 14th, and I think it was 4 days later that they fired Lee Eastman from representing the Beatles and being their legal representation. They wrote that nasty note that was signed by three of them. And, then not long after that, they did the session at Olympic that ended badly when the three Beatles tried to get Paul to sign the contract with Alan Klein. So they're right in the midst of this. And you see that to that point in the year, all this energy flowing right out of the Apple sessions at the end of January. And then February, they start working on She's So Heavy and something. And they've been taking time off in March for the two principal Beatles to get married, but then they resumed the sessions again in April. And after that first week of May, they stopped dead until July. So it's unfortunate that they were fighting this battle. But even in the studio, they could still compartmentalize and keep the personal stuff out of it and work together really, really well.
We're going to be talking more about the Beatles breaking up next year because I think most people associate Let It Be with the Beatles breakup rather than Abbey Road, even though it's not. That's actually not the order in which those events occurred. But certainly next year, there have been rumblings, no official word, but it seems very likely that we are going to get, well, we know we're going to get a movie. We know we're going to get a DVD. We're going to get a re-edited version of Let It Be.
Lord of the Ringo.
A re-edited Let It Be, which could be very promising. There's so much material there. And then I think also the original film on that disc as well as maybe a bonus. That's a rumor I've heard.
It's been sitting around remastered since the time of Let It Be Naked.
Right, yeah. It's been just waiting to be born.
Yeah.
And but we'll probably also get a box set. This could be a 60-disc box set.
Yep.
Whether or not they go that route, I don't know. I don't know what sort of magic Giles Martin could pull off to make some of that stuff interesting.
He was conceived during those sessions, you know.
Was he really?
Yeah,
Oh.
He was born October 9th that year on John Lennon's birthday.
Wow.
So doing the math.
Yeah, so so that's how his father worked out his frustrations. Oh, I see.
Right. What am I going to do with the rest of the day? They sent me home.
Honey. Anyway, we talked about it before. We are going to run out of 50th anniversary soon, but it could start up again. And there are plenty of albums that did not get the deluxe box set edition. So I guess that's what we have to look forward to in the next few years.
It seems like there should be now, they're going to backtrack at least to certain ones, if not every album. And yes, I get that they're limited in what they've got laying around, although it seems that Please Please Me is rich with outtakes if they wanted to go that route. And they could certainly do the remixing on a lot of these to center the vocals that were in the really bad 60s stereo mixes. And, Revolver, Rubber Soul, they certainly call out for a treatment of whatever outtakes you got laying around. So it'd be very interesting to see where they go with this. But, if you're talking 60th anniversary, by the time they get around to it, it's like, well, I guess they're writing off the first generation of fans.
Right. Robert, of course, you do a podcast which has just grown and grown despite some problems with Apple. And I don't mean Beatles Apple, I mean the other
Right.
Apple.
Yeah.
But
All fixed now.
All fixed now. Something About the Beatles is back on iTunes and back in everyone's lives.
Yep, Spotify as well. A lot of it will be talking to people that were either directly involved, such as Kevin Harrington going back to the beginning of '69, the redhead on the roof, who was their gopher and little assistant that you see during the rooftop sessions and throughout Let It Be. And also just people that were moved by the Beatles' influence that went on to create art of their own. Ray Connolly, great journalist and insider friend of theirs who was around watching things happen. All kinds of people like that. And there is no shortage of things to talk about with the Beatles.
Robert, it's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and I look forward to doing it again sooner than later.
Always my pleasure, David. Thanks for having me.